It would take me a week to tell you half the splendour of it. At the beginning of the 20th century, awfully born William Bulfin paid several visits to Ireland from Argentina, where he worked as a reporter among the expat Irish community. His book Rambles in Éireann was published in 1907. One of the writer's rambles was his visit to the Glen of Aherlow, and on a whim climb Galtymore. He did not get to the top, but managed above the tree line, from which vantage point on the slope of the mountain he could look north across the valley, catch the light refracted on the river that watered those jumbled fields, and see the larch-covered southern slope of Shlievnamuck, and higher still, the dark tops of fir trees. Staying in the Royal Hotel in Tipperary town and not wishing to risk his bicycle on rough roads, Bulfin hired a jaunting car and a driver to take him to the glen. Getting to the crest of Shlievnamuck is quite a climb, and Bulfin left his transport to explore on his own. Looking north, he could see the town from which he had departed, and stretching out before him a great plain, part of the Golden Vale. Because Bulfin had no guide, he clearly missed the best viewing point of all, an erratic known as the Rock of Torf. Behind our traveller was the southern slope of Shlievnamuck, which he now descended, part of the natural rampart that defined the Glen of Aherlow. A 100 and more years ago, as Bulfin descended Shlievnamuck to the floor of the valley, he passed through a landscape far more connected to the past than we know today. Then, a woodland of ancient oaks, with the trunks and even the upper forks of the oaks green with tufts of beautiful fern. Today, commercially grown Scots pine and some mountain ash. A landscape periodically, in the words of a poet, hacked clean for better bearing. Looking south towards the Galties, and Bulfin was intensely aware of the enchantment of air and light, so that the mountains that once seemed so distant, now apparently almost within a stone's throw. Aherlow as seen today, mountain and hill, lakes and river, and a valley floor, a flourish of greens defined by seemingly patternless hedgerows. It all seems unchanging, timeless, which is exactly what it is not. Our here and now, the view from the statue, means nothing in the context of geological time. The hundreds of millions of years, clashing continents, floods of lava, aeons of erosion, and most recently, just thousands and not millions of years ago, the impact of ice on rock, with its legacy of the Galtee Lakes. This is a landscape of layers and folds. Through unimaginable time, erosion deposited what is known as old red sandstone, a reddish conglomerate from traces of iron oxide. Then, with changes in the configuration of land and sea, limestone accumulated, but when continental plates impacted each other, the land folded and buckled, producing the east-west alignment of the Galtees and associated upland, and leaving a sandstone mountain and limestone valley floor. The last shaping of this landscape was caused by freezing and melting of water across the various ice ages, the last of which ended as recently as some 10,000 years ago. Just as we may see this landscape as unchanging, we may also think that those who came before us thought about this place as we do, as a pretty picture postcard pattern of hill and hollow. An essential point is that for most of the history of the Aherlow region, this enchantment with nature would have been utterly meaningless. It is only in the past few hundred years, a tiny sliver of time, that mountain and forest have not been variously thought of as fearsome places, where gods resided, where spirits lurked, where dangers threatened. Early Christians had no difficulty believing that God was found there. Late 18th century Romanticism brought a transformation in feelings and ideas about the natural world. The wilder the landscape, the more authentic the feelings. No one prior to that sea change thought of climbing a mountain for pleasure. No one stood in Tipperary town, looked towards Galtymore on a fine day and said, "Let's climb a mountain." Bulfin knew something about the history of Aherlow, in a romantic sort of way. That for centuries it was a wild and lonely fastness resorted to by many a fugitive from English law. The government and its agents had a contrary perspective. In 1840, when a mail coach was held up and robbed, the reference was to, and I quote, "the Glen of Aherlow, a place renowned in the annals of crime." A few years later, during the Great Famine, there appeared to be confirmation of this, when Edmund Ryan, John Walsh and Timothy Dwyer, three bailiffs engaged by Tipperary Poor Law Union to seize crops in default of a tax payment, were brutally murdered in Curravoke, a townland immediately east of Rossendred and stretching south into the mountains. Access to Aherlow was never easy. For people in the surrounding settlements as they looked towards Galtymore, as it loomed over Aherlow, the mountain was a barrier and the forest a threat. For most of the 800 years that the town of Tipperary has been a settlement, townspeople looked south and shuddered. It's worth remembering that it was not until the early and mid-19th century, and then not without complaints about the money being spent and value being delivered, that roads were cut through Aherlow. A conundrum to contemplate. Did the roads conform to the field system, or the pattern of fields to the roads? The oldest road was a version of the R664 taking travellers from Tipperary town into the glen, which of course meant traversing Slievnamuck at its most accessible point. As a route through to Mitchelstown, by the second decade of the 19th century, it was a so-called coach road, made famous through Biancany's enterprise. This slice of road through the townland of Garryduff was less vertiginous than the current road with its dramatic hairpin. The owner of Garryduff was Stafford O'Brien, who died in 1864 and who had homes in Clare and Northamptonshire. Having in 1833 provided a well in his part of Tipperary town, and still flowing, a much poorer copy was erected on this coach road. Where there are roads and a river, there are bridges. In Aherlow, the river runs between the two valley roads. On the upper road, the primary bridge is just beyond Lisvernane on the Limerick border. On the lower mountain road, the topography was more difficult, and so there are more bridges. A testament to necessity, as grand juries were torn between not spending money on more remote areas and spending money in order to ease access to lawless areas. An inevitable part of living in Aherlow was occasional flooding, as water poured into the valley, overwhelming the limited drainage. In the 1930s, there appears to have been a series of such catastrophes. Because we take roads for granted, we find it difficult to imagine a landscape without a particular road. In the Glen, the R664 from the Aherlow Fáilte T-junction to the statue is more recent than other roads. Also, the road from Tipperary town, when it reached the top of Slievnamuck, appears to have veered towards the present Aherlow House Hotel Road, which joins the R663 near the site of the Glen Hotel. Of the two parallel roads along the valley, the lower or mountain road is the more recent. In 1847, at the height of the Great Famine, there was something of a hullabaloo when a threatening notice was posted on the bridge at Rossadrad, then under construction, and I quote, "on the new line of road through the Glen of Aherlow." The overseer's life was threatened if he didn't employ more than one man and his horse from each house in the locality, and to take back some men that he had dismissed. Of course, in a time of famine, employment was literally a matter of life and death. On this occasion, a man not from the locality was assaulted and threatened with death if he did not give up his job and leave the area. The Glen of Aherlow was not really a place many individuals visited for pleasure until bicycles turned out to be the open sesame to this special place that came into its own during the emergency. Elsewhere, the Second World War. A place easily reached from Tipperary town for an afternoon's outing. Stamina was needed, as this advertisement from 1938 proclaimed. The fun went on from 4 in the afternoon to 3 the following morning. This opening up of the region was greatly helped when in 1950 Colonel Charteris of the Butler Care Estate made a shooting lodge at Ballydavid available to an Oiga. That same year, 1950, in November, in what was known as the Turntable, a statue of Christ the King was erected. A piece of work, it will be admitted, more interesting because of location than appearance. 1950 was a holy year, and the dedication to Christ the King was very much an expression of Cold War attitudes, explicitly explained in the dedication sermon. How the power of Christ the King would prevail against the hammer and sickle. But that's old politics. Today at the site, better to be reminded of that Hopkins line, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed." Because of that view from the statue, captured in a myriad of photographs, we perhaps think of Aherlow in terms of landscape rather than nature. The point, of course, is that landscape impacts even if you do not move from the statue. But for nature, you really do have to move about a bit. Today, the Glen of Aherlow embraces visitors, strollers, walkers, climbers, runners, ramblers, and cyclists. All who come, from the sedentary who perch at Christ the King and look across the valley to the mountains, to the energetic for whom exercise on the Galties presents no great challenge. And between those two, the mild charge of the paths through the forest and the narrow roads through the glen. If you're lucky, you may hear the song of a goldcrest as it forages in the cracks of tree bark, or you may see a tree creeper as it hunts its supper. Depending on the time of the year, your ears may well be caressed by a concert of birdsong. Nature's reward for venturing on the mountain is the chance to see those masters of the air: peregrines, kestrels, sparrowhawks, hen harriers, and if you're especially fortunate, you might see, striding high there in his riding of the rolling level underneath him steady air, a white-tailed eagle. That you should be so lucky. Walking through the woodland, more likely the banality of the evergreen than the russet enterprise of the deciduous, the vivid yellow of the gorse to the promiscuous profusion of the intrusive rhododendron, all will engage and delight. More complicated feelings will be stimulated by the determination of mushrooms, all shapes, sizes, and colours, to colonize the woodland. Most startling, perhaps, and disturbing is the vivid red of the fly agaric, a mushroom that looks so threatening, you hardly need to be told that it does not go well with steak. There may be a floral reward for those who venture towards the clouds, where rare alpine plants are to be found. Look, but do not touch. Leaving aside its occasional coating of snow, the mountain with its several peaks, Galtymore at 3,018 feet, the highest, generally presents a colour palette of muted tones, browns and greens, but which at certain times can appear blue. Certainly, in Houseman's words, blue remembered hills, and for some indeed, the land of lost content. The naming of places is part of the ownership of places, in Irish, Dinchanchus. No hero in ancient times was greater than Fionn McCool, and one of the stories about him relates how, when he was young, he fled to Munster to escape enemies. Arriving at Cullen, he fell in love with Critna, daughter of Lochan, a renowned smith. Lochan made 2 mighty spears for Fionn, who before he went on his way was warned of a ferocious wild boar terrorizing the countryside. Fionn set out to find the savage animal which attacked him and which he killed with a spear throw. Our hero returned to Lochan with the head of the animal, and from that time, the place where the animal was killed was known as Sliabh na Muc. An ancient name for the Galties was Crotacliac, or Clues, harps. The harps were based on a fanciful notion that natural features, such as watercourses on the side of the mountain, looked like 2 harps. Clew was a magical figure, a man of the fairies, who was a year making music without food and without sleep. However, the otherworldly forces ranged against him proved too strong. The earth burst open, and there emerged a monster which consumed the harper. And from then to now, this creature continues to dwell in one of the lakes, making occasional, terrifying appearances. At the spot where he died of terror, Clew sang sweet melody. There seized him there suddenly, not unprotected, the loathly dragon that dwells in this place. It was entirely understandable that people would look towards the mountain and its valley as strange and forbidding places, sources of potential danger, and places where in times of turmoil the law played no part. In such circumstances, stories and legends abounded. In 1838, William, a brother of the famous writer of ghost stories Sheridan Le Fanu from a County Limerick family, together with some friends on a summer's evening, took a short cut across the mountains from Mitchelstown Caves, which they'd been exploring. They had a guide, but he was no help, and when they later recounted their encounter with an enchanted horse that galloped by them, their listeners were terrified, seeing it as a monster that emerged from one of the lakes. Pigs and harps and horses, creations of a Gaelic mindset, ways of making sense of difficult places. There was, however, an alternative perspective, formed by the European classical tradition. From his castle at Kilcolman on the other side of the Galties, the English courtier, scholar and poet Edmund Spenser looked north, and in the creation of his great, long poem, The Fairy Queen, he imagined a universe of squabbling gods and goddesses, all derived from the classical tradition. The new Olympus is not in Greece, but in Tipperary on Galtee Moor, which the poet calls Aherlow Hill. The gods assembled all on Aherlow Hill, as well those that are sprung of heavenly seed, as those that all the other world do fill, and rule both sea and land unto their will. The presiding genius is nature, who on Aherlow sat, her garment was so bright and of wondrous sheen, that my frail wit cannot devise what it to compare. In keeping with such an occasion, the Galties had to look their best, and anxious to honour the god who did deck himself in freshest fair attire, and his high head that seemeth always hoar, meaning grey, with hardened frosts of former winter's ire, he with an oaken garland now did tire, meaning dress. Spenser, with his learning derived from Greek and Roman sources, made a new stage for a retelling of classical myths. In the story of Diana and Actaeon, Diana, a goddess of the hunt, is bathing naked in a forest pool when she finds a hunter named Actaeon spying on her. Not best pleased, she changes him into a stag, so that his own hounds pursue and kill him. Diana, full of indignation, thenceforth abandoned her delicious brook, in whose sweet stream, before that bad occasion, so much delight to bathe her limbs she took, but also quite forsook all those fair forests about Aherlow hid, and all that mountain which it doth overlook, the richest land that may else be rid, and the fair shore, in which 1,000 salmons bred. In these lines, Spenser reimagines this great mythic story being played out on Tipperary soil, and that thereafter Diana abandons what was a paradise and allows the land to become a home for thieves and wolves. No doubt such ideas of a beautiful landscape being a place of threat reflected the reality of settlers like Spenser as they looked towards mountain and forest, out of which the bloodthirsty natives might, and in the end did, pour. Many centuries before Spenser filled the mountain with the otherworldly, the glen nurtured various holy places, where trees and isolation provided sanctuary rather than danger. When Ireland was Gaelic, when political power was exercised by the Eonacht kings at Cashel, they were supportive of holy men and holy places. Religious sites in Aherlow and elsewhere were like bonfires on a dark night, centres of light and comfort. Chief merit of tree-crowded isolation was closeness to God. While native rulers were willing to attack a holy place associated with a rival, the coming of the Vikings changed everything. Over time, place and saint become linked. Clonbeg and Sedna, Tureen and Pecan, Ardan and Berhat. With the opening up of Aherlow through the building of new estate-promoted and grand jury-financed roads, what was hidden stood revealed. This was especially the case with Clonbeg, which name of course suggests a small opened area surrounded by woodland. The site also gave its name to the parish and is close to the Aherlow River. The saint associated with the site is Sedna, a figure unsurprisingly tied to the MacBryans of Aherlow, a branch of a family reaching back to the great Brian Boru. Following the impact of the Dawsons and the Masseys, an Anglican church was built around 1740. Not on a virgin site, but a location with very old Christian associations and a site of popular worship, with its holy well and associated votive offerings. A century or so later, and a new church was being built when one of the colleagues of the antiquarian and scholar John O'Donovan visited in May 1840. Writing in the school's folklore collection nearly a century ago, it was recorded that
the pattern falls on the 21st of July. Only very few give their rounds there now. Up to about 50 or 60 years ago, crowds used to come there during the pattern. On the pattern day, 3 rounds were sufficient, but on the other 9 days, it was necessary to give 9 rounds. The rounds consisted of the saying of the beads, while walking round the path in the graveyard, 5 pater and aves at the well on return. The water was supposed to be a cure for blindness and lameness.
Towards the other end of the valley, and in a different parish, Killardry, is the ancient church site in the townland of Tureen, associated with Pecan. A probable date for his death is around 690. Archaeological evidence suggests that a site like this was used variously across several centuries. Perhaps the site was in use up to the 12th century, but thereafter it continued to be a focus for popular devotion, especially in times of persecution. The site with its church, holy well, broken crosses and hollowed stones has been excavated several times and is a managed ruin. Stones tidied up and fixed in place to prevent theft. The third of these early Christian sites is today the least accessible and is in a different parish from the other 2, being in the townland of Ardan in Temple Nairi. Known as St. Berhat's Kyle, This references to a circular enclosure protected by trees and bushes. The word Kyle presumably relates to kill, a church. Aspects of this site are deceptive, in that there was no building found, and whatever structure is there was a creation of the OPW in 1946, as it cleared the site, gathered all the incised stones, 72 in number, and built them into a wall. Such fragments indicate that once upon a time there was a religious foundation of some kind, flourishing in the 8th century, a time associated with Decoherence. Nearby is a well with various alleged properties and linked rituals. Decoherence, about whom even less is known than usual, is more associated with Tullylease in Cork than with Aherlow. He may have died in 839, and his pattern day is the 18th of February. One of the features of this atmospheric place is that there was a long tradition of burying unbaptized infants. In default of the institutional church, the Church of the People provided a spiritual haven for those poor souls. There is a fourth religious site in the region, but from a very different time. This is at the exposed western edge of the valley, close to the intrusive Anglo-Norman settlement known as the Town of the Foreigners, or Galbally. Moor Abbey, the origin of the name is uncertain, may be a 13th century Franciscan foundation. But what we see today dates to a renewal from 1471. According to the Four Masters, it was burned the following year. The point is that the abbey was in an exposed position at a difficult time, especially when the Reformation was underway. Today, the bell tower, or what's left of it, is the most striking feature of this very compact ruin. Given that the abbey was a very fixed built feature in an extensive landscape of trees, during the Tudor Wars, Moor Abbey was often a gathering point for English troops as they sought their enemies in the forest. English soldiers under Sir Humphrey Gilbert burnt it in 1569, and in the following year it was again attacked. This time, some of the friars were killed. For hundreds of years after the Normans arrived, Aherlow can be thought of as a kind of Sherwood forest. A place where people fled when on the wrong side of what was for most an alien law. Emly and Galbally were in the nature of frontier settlements. In 1313, when the English writ still ran, one of the MacBryans killed the son of a settler family in Emly and straightway fled to the forest. The point of interest is that MacBryan, like countless others through the centuries, saw Aherlow as a place of refuge. Across hundreds of years, this did not change. In 1780, John Massy and William Baker, acting as magistrates, were thanked by their colleagues for catching a desperate band of bandits who for too long infested the country from their hideout at Glen of Aherlow. This is a large townland north of the Upper Valley Road and includes the statue of Christ the King. No wonder a later police station was sited in that townland. In the winter of 1843, there was alarm among more respectable people when some 20 armed men made their presence felt in and around Tipperary town. Then it was reported that they got into the Aherlow woods and remained there, for they knew that then they were secure from all pursuit. The spread of English law and administration in the Middle Ages was somewhat start and stop. In the early days of the Norman conquest, favoured knights were granted huge tracts of land to hold unto the crown, and in turn to divide among their own men, all of which meant the creation of new territorial designations, often adapting or adopting existing borders. Under the Normans, the Glen of Aherlow was divided between Muskerry in Tipperary and Nahalach in Limerick. This division is somewhat replicated in the organisation of Roman Catholic parishes, Bancha Kilmyler to the east and Galbally Aherlow to the west. One of the most famous names from this long ago is Brian Boru, who defeated both Irish rivals and Vikings to make himself High King and, of course, become the progenitor of the O'Briens. Garrisons were maintained at Duntralig and Dungrut. Following Brian Boru's famous death at Clontarf, his many sons had many sons, so that within a few generations, members of that family appeared to be everywhere. By the 13th century, the MacBryans of Aherlow were a threatening presence and were descendants of Kennedy MacBryan Dowell, who was a great-great-great-great-grandson of Brian Boru. One may see why Galbally was the town of the foreigners, as records from around this period list various Englishmen and even one Welshman as occupying and working the land. The other side of the Aherlow Valley, firmly in Tipperary, was part of the territory of Muskerry and was dominated by the Burkes. Not everyone was pleased. John Cantwell, who was Archbishop of Cashel for 30 years from 1452, was praised for waging war against local enemies, especially the Burkes, whom he accused of taking church lands. Having put everyone under interdict, the Archbishop had to recover Killardry. This was the honour of overriding power for the Church. Long before he had striven for Clún Finglas and Clán na Gulán, it was part of his duty in which he accepted war until both were returned into his possession. In the 16th century, the time of the Tudors, Aherlow had a very coherent identity, part of a vast forested area stretching south. Sir John Perrott, at one time Lord Deputy, spent much of his time dealing with rebels and complained about one of them. When I seek him in Aherlow, he flies to the Great Wood, and when I go there, he comes back to Aherlow. When I go to Aherlow, he's in the mountain, and when I follow him to the mountains, he's in Aherlow. A surprise attack by government troops coming in from the west found rebels in their cabins. 30 were killed and livestock, horses and weapons taken. The rest ran into the wood and escaped. During that most contentious of centuries, Aherlow was a place where the interests of various families clashed. The Burkes, the O'Briens, the Butlers, the Fitzgeralds. Regarding these last two families, Butlers and Fitzgeralds, who fought to the death while intermarrying, matters became even more complicated when in the mid-1560s, the Fitzgerald Earl of Desmond married a Butler woman, who, as a dowry, brought with her lands and fortified houses at Balnacorty, Aherlow and Ballydread, thus giving the Fitzgeralds a toehold in the region the Butlers regarded as their own. Soon there was open rebellion, with the trees of Aherlow providing cover and refuge, whereas the tower houses or fortifications at Dungrud, Emly, Knockorden, Ardevillane, Balnacorty, Cordangan, Bancha, Kappa, Kilmyler and Ballydread were bases from which the English raided into Aherlow in the hope of capturing or killing the leaders, or at least to get their hands on the cattle, which were at the centre of the local economy. We do not know the physical circumstances under which these rebels lived in such places as Aherlow. Inland from the coast, Ireland was a countryside of, well, countryside, with limited settlements and a pastoral rather than a tillage economy. It was no accident that cattle raids were at the heart of Gaelic sagas. The Germans had their Nibelung, we had livestock. Sometimes things went well for the rebels. For example, the description in an Irish source of what happened after rebels attacked and burned Kilmallock in 1571, an important staging post for government forces and made to seem like a veritable treasure trove. The rebels were engaged for the space of 3 days and 3 nights in carrying away the several kinds of riches and precious goods, as cups and ornamental goblets upon their horses and steeds, to the woods and forests of Aherlow, and sending the others of them privately to their friends or companions. In other words, looking after the cause and looking after family. In 1577, a new president of Munster, William Drury, went from Clare into Limerick with a vigorous and merciless body of soldiers and proceeded to behead the chieftains and rebels of the districts adjacent to Limerick. Among these was Murroch, the son of Murtagh, son of Mahon, son of Donogh, son of Brian Dubh O'Brien, the most renowned and noble of the heirs of Carrickdonnell and Aherlow. Edmund Spencer, who we met previously cavorting with his deities on Galtymore, claimed that he was an eyewitness to the following: the execution of a notable traitor at Limerick called Murroch O'Brien. I saw an old woman, who was his foster mother, who took up his head while he was quartered and sucked up all the blood running thereout, saying that the earth was not worthy to drink it, and therewith also steeped her face and breast and tore her hair, crying and shrieking out most terribly. The Earl of Desmond's position was clarified when in November 1579 he was proclaimed a traitor, and in government dispatches there was a note of hysteria. The traitors burn all the corn they may get and demolish all castles. No doubt the traitors will have foreign aid. The scope of their range includes the Great Wood, Aherlow Wood, Drumfinnan, Glanmire and Glanfrisk, which are their chief fortresses. A desperate proposal to hire labourers to burn these woods would pitch Butler against Fitzgerald and would entail a huge force of soldiers from England, perhaps as many as 4,000 men. John of Desmond, the Earl's brother, was, in the words of the annals, a roving and wandering plunderer. One day in the month of July 1580 went to the woods of Aherlow, attended by so small a body of troops as it was unwise to travel forth, less than 100 footmen and only 13 horsemen. The account goes on to describe how he slept but upon couches of stone or earth. He drank but of the pure cold streams, and from the palms of his hands or his shoes, and his only cooking utensils were the long twigs of the forest. While the Earl of Desmond had diminished personal resources, his enemies had state resources, which as the war moved into 1582 were increasingly directed against the seemingly intractable problem of Irish woodland, the rebels' great asset. Woodland living was hell. In an entry for 1582, the annalist recorded, "Great wind, constant rain, lightning, and much tempestuous weather prevailed successively in these 2 years." Matters continued as before in 1583, but with the Earl of Desmond ranging about the woods at Aherlow, heeding or caring for neither tillage nor reaping, excepting the reaping of butlers by day and night, in revenge of the injuries which the Earl of Ormond had up to that time committed against the Fitzgeralds. With marauding bands ranging across the countryside, careless of both man and beast, there was nothing exaggerated about Spencer's famous description. Out of every corner of the woods and glens they came creeping forth upon their hands, for their legs could not bear them. They looked like anatomies of death. They spoke like ghosts crying out in their graves. They did eat of the dead carrion. In the last months of the conflict, Desmond and his followers were increasingly harried across a desolate landscape. And the end came when he was killed near Tralee. As the century ended, Aherlow remained a place apart. During the 9 Years' War, the English were especially minded to avoid Aherlow, a strong fastness where our army, so pestered with carriages, could not possibly pursue any of the enemy who harried them. Mountain and forest. It was almost instinctive that with defeat after insurrection, rebels would flee to such places. In the 20th century, the reality of geography and landscape was unchanged, when in February 1923, Dennis Lacy and some of his Republican followers were cornered in Aherlow by a substantial Free State force. In a shootout at Ballydavid, there were several fatalities, including Lacy. A few months later, key members of the Republican leadership, Con Maloney, number 2 to Liam Lynch, his brother Jim and Tom Conway, all from Tipperary town, were captured. 2 of the men being wounded. They had been hiding in a hut hidden on the rising ground above Rossadrad. For Dan Breen, the great adventure came full circle. On the 21st of January 1919, Breen and Tracy turned south from Solhead Beg and towards the mountain. And on the 20th of April 1923, Breen was discovered in a dugout near Galbally. Over those years, actual military conflict as experienced in Aherlow very much flowed from the industrial strife on the Massy Dawson Saunders mill and the British response of maintaining localised garrisons, one of which was at Newtown. Such garrisons had to be supplied, and on the 13th of November 1920, Lacy's flying column at Lisnagowl ambushed a lorry on such a mission, resulting in several fatalities. There's a debate about how much and when Ireland lost its woodlands. As Tipperary knows, Codda Yenimid Fasta Gan Imid. In Aherlow, the growth of trees had political implications, especially in the 16th century, when, as discussed, there was a sequence of rebellions against the Crown. By the time of the Civil Survey in the 17th century, only Clonbeg had a significant quantity of commercially valuable woodland. In fact, that parish had nearly half of such stock in the entire region. For a long time, the nature of Aherlow and its landscape kept out the foreigner, the prospective settler, the chancer from the mainland on the make in Ireland. Many great families in Ireland were founded by just such chaps. Given the nature of the landscape, it was unlikely that surveyors ventured too far into the valley, and so there was probably huge under-reporting. It might be argued that trees more than any other element influenced the naming of places in Aherlow. This is not a reference to place names that have an arboreal element, but is a much broader point. The main support for this argument is a preponderance of purely Irish townland names. Of 25 townlands in Clonbeg, only a handful, places like Stone Park and Newtown, are not Gaelic. In Clonballogue, just one name, Tankerstown, connects to the Norman conquest. In Templenairi, again with 25 townlands, the standout amid the Gaelic names is Ashgrove, a classic estate management construct, as a planter family sought to literally mark their territory. In the 1650s, the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland was completed, and the way was set for the granting of swathes of Irish land to both soldiers and civilians, speculators and merchants who had supported Parliament against the King. First of all, the land was surveyed. The English government needed to know what it had before it was given away. It should not surprise that in Aherlow there was a massive underestimation of acreage. In Clonbeg, for example, the survey was out by 70%, which in that instance worked to the advantage of the Ashe and Dawson families. Of the acreage returned for Clonbeg, some 2/3 was designated as unprofitable. Taking the whole region, nearly half was put in that category, which meant that Cromwellian grantees ended up with a lot more statute acres than intended, but can hardly have been pleased that their Irish estate was on the side of a mountain. The civil parish of Clonbeg is 25 townlands, over 13,000 acres or 21 square miles. And all this, with the exception of one townland, was granted to John Dawson. He established his seat at Ballynacorty, where there was a battered tower house, and where in time Ballynacorty House more fittingly reflected a family that owned some 19,000 acres in the county. For a time the property was known as New Forest. Dawson's granddaughter married into the Massy family, who had been granted a great deal of land across the border into County Limerick. A match made in the accountant's office. Following this marriage of money and ambition, the family became Massy Dawson, and through the 18th and 19th centuries dominated the region. The first Massy Dawson as such was James, who died in 1790. In 1757, as this public notice proclaims, he was busy rigorously enforcing the game laws on his land. His portrait suggests that he valued pheasants more highly than peasants. Like on many estates, a little village developed, but without formal planning, in the townland of Lisvernane, and took that name. It's on the R663 linking Banshee and Galbally, and is close to Ballynacorty. The attractive little church dates from 1835 and is the Aherlow part of the Roman Catholic parish of Galbally and Aherlow. The Massy Dawson family in the 19th century was essentially a father and his two sons. Famously fat, James Hewitt Massy Dawson built the house and died in 1834, weighing in at 20 stone. As an MP and substantial landowner, he felt entitled to a peerage, which, however, was not forthcoming. His heir was an Anglican clergyman who lived mainly in England and died in 1850, leaving his brother, Captain George, to come out of the army and run the show for most of the next 50 years. The Massy Dawsons were more or less resident, and given how poor much of the upland was, their tenants fared less badly than on many other estates with much better land. On some of the Aherlow estate, however, there was a disconnect between the poor quality of the land and the demands put on it by an expanding population. This is something to always remember: the sheer weight of people on the landscape before the famine. Along this road, having come down the hill from the statue and going towards Banshee, the townland to the left is Gurt of Oher, some 1,300 acres of not very good land. 50 years ago, there were 72 people in 21 houses. But before the famine, there were 674 people existing in 103 houses. This reality of a teeming countryside very much comes across in the circumstances of a dramatic murder in 1835. One of the stories gathered for the school's folklore collection in the 1930s was that a man named Nicholas Hill was killed for grabbing a farm. This was an echo of the murder of Matthew Hill in August 1835, not far from Clonbeg Church. A new landlord was often a tricky time, and the Reverend John Massy Dawson had recently succeeded his father. Hill acted as local agent for the estate, and on a Friday afternoon was supervising the cutting of oak timber with around 50 men at work, when an armed gang of 5 brutally murdered him and had no trouble getting away. At issue was the state control of marginal upland in circumstances of acute population pressure. A few months later, on a night in February, perhaps as many as 150 men gathered to level a newly erected boundary ditch. Of interest is the fact that Captain Massy Dawson was positively remembered in the school's folklore collection of the 1930s.
He was not a bad landlord during the Land League, and his tenants were fairly comfortable. He always kept in touch with the district and lived there during that period, and employed a good many men working on the estate. There were no evictions on his estate.
This last is not exactly true. It should be said that Captain Massy Dawson did not wait for 20th century land purchase legislation, but sold much of the estate to its tenants in the 1890s, and without a lot of fuss. Captain George died in 1897, and by the early 20th century what was left of the estate was owned by a collateral descendant, Robert Massy Dawson Saunders. Saunders and his father Thomas, each in his time, managed the estate. The father, Thomas Saunders, was not well regarded as an agent by a local poet. For 30 years, through woe and tears, he plied his vile vocation and gathered rent at 5% for thieves that rob our nation. If Saunders was getting 5% of the rental, he was doing well, as the Glen of Aherlow estate produced an annual income of at least €600,000 in today's values. A substantial amount of this income was already committed in family charges, interest payments, and so on. And, of course, dowries for daughters. The wedding of Massy Dawson's eldest daughter, Grace, in 1881 added to the weight of debt on the estate. But it was also an occasion for communal celebration, with tenants lining the route between Balnacourty House and Clonbeg Church. Families like the Massy Dawsons could never take their survival for granted. In 1689, Catholic James II threatened such families with dispossession. In March 1867, Captain George and some neighbours huddled behind shutters, fearful of Fenian attack. It didn't come, but the small police barracks at Gert the Voher, near the statue of Christ the King, was attacked unsuccessfully. A few decades later, the outcome was very different. By the early 1920s, he and his family were assailed by the IRA, who on one occasion tried to kill him, and by striking workers, who were manipulated by outside agitators to take over the sawmills and declare a Soviet. Unsurprisingly, the family fled to England, and Balnacourty House was burned in May 1922. The extensive timber milling business was also destroyed. Disputes about compensation were drawn out and complicated, with claims made for Balnacourty, Castlereagh House, also in the Glen, Clonbeg Rectory, Clonbeg Schoolhouse, Galtymore Shooting Lodge, and, of course, the forestry and sawmilling businesses. In today's values, the compensation sought was around €4.5 million. While the house at Balnacourty was not rebuilt, in 1936, Saunders did build a house on the site which is today the Aherlow House Hotel. Robert Massy Dawson Saunders, a refugee from Ireland, died in England in December 1941. A connection with Aherlow that began in the 1650s finally ended in 1947 with the sale of what was left of the estate, consisting of Aherlow House, described as in a sheltered position with extensive views of the Galties, surrounded by 100 acres of open woodland and 44 acres of grassland. Also the Glen of Aherlow Hotel and 5 acres on the main road. Finally, there was the investment potential of the 970 acres leased to the Forestry Department for 150 years. After the emergency years in Ireland, the Aherlow Hotel was occupied by the Muller family, a landscape that must have reminded them of their Austrian homeland. In various incarnations, with its spectacular site, the place has been a hotel since then. Here, close to the parish church in Bancha, is the grave of the Reverend Trevor Lloyd Ashe, who died in 1864. In minor orders, he became a Roman Catholic, in part to the influence of Father Theobald Matthew. The irony is that his ancestor, along with Massy and Dawson, were the 17th century grantees who won when Gaelic and Catholic Ireland lost. Jonathan Ashe settled in the region and, like neighbour Dawson, augmented his estate through limited purchase. The 7,685 acres of the Ashe family was contiguous to the Massy Dawson property. Between them, these two families essentially owned the Glen of Aherlow. In terms of parishes, the Massy Dawsons with Clonbeg and the Ashe family with Temple Nowry. Like many estates, the Ashe property, a lot of which was not very good land, was in debt after the Great Famine, and in the mid-1850s was sold to the Moore family of Mooresfort, who had recently arrived in the region from England and were Roman Catholic. The last of the family in place, the Reverend Trevor Lloyd Ashe, was, to say the least, eccentric, and moved by the Gothic spirit of the age, built a Gothic-inspired castle called Castle Mary, which, however, was hardly up when it began to fall down. A Gothic folly built on sand. Given his antecedents, it was a dramatic turnaround when in 1846 Trevor Lloyd Ashe was listed as paying his repeal rent to Daniel O'Connell in company with the parish priest of Banshire. In the mid-18th century, the Butler estate in and around Banshire was divided between the O'Brien and Archer families. With the O'Brien butlers holding Banshire Castle, the Archer butlers needed a local residence, and so the castle was built at the beginning of the 19th century. Secreted in the woods, different owners of the castle, both Archer, Butler and Moore, sometimes found that it was surplus to requirements. Of course, it's not a castle, but it was part of the early 19th century Gothic revival craze for all things medieval and romantic. When Pierce Archer Butler died in 1827 at the age of 69, his passing occurred at Aherlow Castle, his occasional residence. His son James lived at Garnavilla near Cahir. Certainly in 1846, William Keane, the parish priest of Banshire, rented the house or castle so that he had the finest parochial residence in the diocese. The castle came into the hands of the Moore family of Mooresfort when they purchased the Archer Butler estate in 1854. Since then, Aherlow Castle has had its ups and downs and is currently on an up. Before we leave Aherlow, a brief mention of a name closely but wrongly associated with the place. One of the best-known poems or songs of the period, written by Charles Kickham in 1857, tells the story of Patrick Sheehan, who served in the British Army in the Crimean War of the mid-1850s. He was blinded and discarded and was arrested for begging in Grafton Street in Dublin. The opening lines are well known but misleading. My name is Patrick Sheehan, and my years are 34. Tipperary is my native place, not far from Galtymore. I've come of honest parents, but now they're lying low, and many the happy day I spent in the Glen of Aherlow. My father died. I closed his eyes outside our cabin door. The landlord and the sheriff too were there the day before. And then my loving mother and sisters, 3 also, were forced to go with broken hearts from the Glen of Aherlow. For 3 long months, in search of work, I wandered far and near. I went into the poorhouse to see my mother dear. The news I heard nigh broke my heart, but still, in all my woe, I blessed the friends who made their graves in the Glen of Aherlow. Misleading because this has nothing to do with Aherlow and is not about the Great Famine. Like a proper Fenian, Kickham's message was about not serving in the British Army, and the Sheehan story conveyed that. But the reality should never get in the way of the connection fashioned by time and sentiment between Patrick Sheehan and his beloved Glen of Aherlow. This has been a portrait of the Glen of Aherlow, one person's point of view, with the emphasis very much on its history. Lying between mountain and hill, bordered by the Galties and Slievnamuck, the Aherlow Valley is a defined landscape. A place of woodlands and fields, of river and lakes, of open vistas and secret hollows, of ancient worship and modern wellness, of half-remembered stories and evidentiary history. A place to visit, a place to enjoy, a place to remember. From his exile in America, the Fenian poet J.J. Finn Miles remembered the landscape of his youth. In summer's rich glow and in winter's wild weather, Fionn MacCool's famous hill Slievnamuck, and the Galtie's tall summits rising proudly behind it, so stately, majestic, and mild. The author recognized that this trinity of landscapes, hill, mountain, and valley, had individual charms, while each allowed a perspective to admire the others, as William Bulfin found during his ramble. If you have enjoyed this virtual visit to a special place, why not pay an actual visit?
My name is Patrick Sheehan, and my age is 34. Tipperary is my native place, not far from Galtymore. Brought up by honest parents, and now they're lying low. On many the pleasant day I spent in the Glen of Aherlow. My father died, I closed his eyes outside our cabin door. The landlord and the sheriff they were there the day before. And then my loving mother and sisters too also were forced to go with broken hearts from the Glen of Aherlow.